London, 1817. Harrington House's chandeliers spilled warm gold over the ballroom as England's finest spun and laughed under the carved ceiling. Half hidden behind a potted fern, Miss Harriet Donovan observed with cool composure. At 26, she knew how to disappear and still seem perfectly agreeable. "Another season begins," she murmured to herself, adjusting her pale blue evening gown, a colour chosen not for fashion, but for its ability to render her nearly invisible among the vibrant peacocking of the ton. 7 seasons had passed since her debut. 7 years of watching younger women, some barely 18, being courted, proposed to and wed while she remained firmly on the shelf. Not that she hadn't received offers. There had been several. The gambling-addicted son of a baron, 2 merchants' sons seeking entry to higher society, and an elderly viscount whose breath smelled perpetually of pickled herring. Her father, the Earl of Westfield, approached with 2 glasses of champagne, offering one to his daughter. "You look pensive tonight, my dear," Robert Donovan said, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. Despite his distinguished position, he had always been a gentle soul, more concerned with his daughter's happiness than her status. "Merely observing, father," Harriet replied, accepting the glass. "Lady Catherine's eldest just secured Lord Bentley's son. That makes 3 engagements announced this evening." Her father sighed. "Your mother worries." "Mother always worries," Harriet said with a small smile. "But you needn't concern yourself. I've made peace with my future." "As the companion to your Aunt Philippa?" He frowned. "That was never the life we envisioned for you." "She's not so terrible," Harriet said, though they both knew her eccentric aunt's household in Bath was a place of last resort, the final destination for unmarried nieces with nowhere else to go. Across the room, Harriet's gaze landed on an unfamiliar figure. Tall and imposing, the gentleman stood a head above most others. His attire, though impeccable, lacked the ostentatious embellishments favored by society dandies. Instead, his power seemed to emanate from within, an effortless authority that commanded attention without demanding it. "Who is that?" she asked her father. The Earl followed her gaze and straightened immediately. "Good heavens, that's Sebastian Goddard, the Duke of Ravenswood. I didn't realize he had returned to London." Ravenswood? Harriet tried to recall what little she knew of the man. Hasn't he been abroad? For years. After his father's death, he retreated to his estates in the north, then to the continent. Some say he was instrumental in several diplomatic negotiations during the war, though he's never sought credit for it. He looks, Harriet searched for the right word, severe. Brilliant man, frightfully wealthy, even by ducal standards. They say King George himself seeks his counsel on occasion. Her father lowered his voice. But he's never shown the slightest interest in taking a duchess. Half the matchmaking mamas in London have tried and failed. Harriet watched as Lady Jersey, one of society's most formidable hostesses, approached the Duke. Even she seemed to tread carefully in his presence. "I imagine he finds the season tedious," Harriet mused. "As do you," her father pointed out with a knowing smile. "Yes, but I attend out of duty. What brings a man like him to something as trivial as Lady Harrington's ball?" Before her father could speculate, they were interrupted by her mother, the Countess of Westfield, accompanied by a young man whose eager expression immediately put Harriet on guard. "Harriet, darling," Barbara Donovan said with forced brightness, "you remember Mr. Edmund Chadwick? His father has just purchased that lovely estate in Hertfordshire." The evening progressed as so many others had before. Polite conversation, a dance with Mr. Chadwick, who stepped on her toes twice before telling her at length about his collection of stuffed birds, and eventually a retreat to the card-room, where elderly matrons commented on her enduring beauty, a thinly veiled reference to her advancing age. Near midnight, seeking a moment's respite, Harriet slipped into the relative quiet of Lady Harrington's conservatory. The air was thick with the scent of exotic blooms, and moonlight streamed through the glass ceiling, casting everything in silvery light. She sank onto a stone bench beside a small fountain, closing her eyes to savor the peaceful burble of water. "You disappeared rather abruptly." The deep voice startled her. Harriet's eyes flew open to find the Duke of Ravenswood standing before her, his expression unreadable in the shadows. "Your Grace," she said, rising quickly and dropping into a curtsy. "Forgive me, I didn't hear you approach." "Please sit," he said, his tone making it less a request than a gentle command. After a moment's hesitation, he joined her on the bench, maintaining a proper distance. "You're the Earl of Westfield's daughter." It wasn't a question, but she nodded nonetheless. "Miss Harriet Donovan, Your Grace." "Sebastian Goddard," he replied, as though she might not know who he was. "I'm aware," she said, then bit her lip at her forwardness. To her surprise, the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "Yes, I suppose you would be." He studied her with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable, but instead sparked something warm in her chest. "You're different from the others." "Different?" 7 seasons, and not once have you manipulated an introduction to me. Not once have you or your family orchestrated an accidental meeting. You've never giggled behind your fan in my presence, or feigned a swoon to attract my attention." Harriet stared at him in astonishment. "You've noticed me before?" "I notice everything, Miss Donovan." His eyes, which she now saw were a striking shade of grey, held hers. "I've observed you since your debut. That's—" she searched for the right word. "Somewhat disconcerting." To her surprise, he laughed, a rich, genuine sound that transformed his austere features. Refreshingly honest as well. "Tell me, why are you hiding in the conservatory instead of entertaining potential suitors?" "I might ask why a duke is doing the same," she countered. "Touché." He inclined his head. "I find these gatherings tedious, but occasionally necessary." "As do I," she admitted. "Though in my case it's expected that I continue to participate in the marriage mart, despite overwhelming evidence that I'm destined for spinsterhood." "Are you?" he asked, his expression sobering. "Destined for spinsterhood? 7 seasons would suggest so. Besides, I'm practically ancient by society's standards. Most gentlemen prefer younger brides who haven't developed such inconvenient habits as reading political journals and expressing opinions." Something flickered in his eyes. Interest, perhaps, or amusement. Dreadful habits indeed. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the gentle splash of the fountain. Harriet found herself relaxing in his presence, a strange circumstance given his reputation for intimidating even the most confident members of society. "We should return," she said finally, though reluctantly. "My absence will be noticed eventually. As will mine." He rose and offered his hand to help her stand. When her fingers touched his, a jolt of awareness shot through her. "Thank you for the conversation, Your Grace," she said, withdrawing her hand as quickly as propriety allowed. "Sebastian," he corrected, then added more formally, "to my friends, of which I have very few." "I doubt we know each other well enough for such familiarity," she replied. His smile was slow and deliberate. "Not yet, perhaps." 2 nights later, Harriet found herself at Lord and Lady Whitmore's dinner party, seated between Mr. Chadwick, still enthusiastic about his taxidermy, and an elderly general who was profoundly deaf in his left ear, the one facing her. Across and down the table sat the Duke of Ravenswood, engaged in what appeared to be a deeply serious conversation with their hostess. He hadn't so much as glanced in Harriet's direction all evening, making her wonder if their encounter in the conservatory had been some sort of peculiar dream. The dinner progressed through multiple courses, each more elaborate than the last. By the time dessert was served, an impressive construction of spun sugar and crystallized fruits, Harriet had resigned herself to an evening of nodding politely at Mr. Chadwick's discourse on the proper preservation of pheasant feathers. Then, during a momentary lull in conversation, the Duke rose to reach for the salt cellar. As he did so, he leaned slightly toward Harriet, and in a voice meant only for her ears, murmured, "Finalement eu a rencontré," which means "finally I found you" in Portuguese. The foreign words, spoken in a perfect accent, caught her completely by surprise. Harriet gasped audibly, a small, startled cry escaping her lips before she could prevent it. The entire table fell silent, all eyes turning toward her. Heat flooded her cheeks as she realized she had become the center of attention, the very position she had spent 7 years carefully avoiding. The Duke settled back in his chair, the barest hint of a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. His eyes, fixed on hers across the table, held not mockery, but something far more dangerous, satisfaction. The silence stretched, becoming increasingly uncomfortable, until Harriet did the only thing she could think of. She reached for her wine glass and raised it slightly. "I was just thinking," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "that we haven't properly acknowledged our gracious hosts for this splendid evening. To Lord and Lady Whitmore." Relief washed over the table as the guests murmured their agreement and raised their glasses. Conversation gradually resumed, the momentary disruption forgotten by all, except Harriet and the Duke, whose gaze remained fixed on her with undisguised interest. Later, as the ladies withdrew to the drawing-room, leaving the gentlemen to their port and cigars, Lady Elizabeth Norwood, Harriet's cousin and closest confidant, pulled her aside. "What happened at dinner?" she whispered. "I've never seen you lose composure like that." "It was nothing," Harriet insisted, though her flushed cheeks suggested otherwise. "A momentary indisposition." Elizabeth's skeptical expression made it clear she wasn't convinced. "It wouldn't have anything to do with the Duke of Ravenswood watching you all evening, would it?" "He wasn't watching me," Harriet protested, though her heart quickened at the suggestion. "My dear cousin, that man hasn't taken his eyes off you since we arrived." Elizabeth fanned herself dramatically. "If he looked at me that way, I'd swoon on the spot. What did he say to make you jump so?" Harriet hesitated. "He spoke to me in Portuguese." "Portuguese, whatever for?" "I haven't the faintest idea." But she did have an idea, a troubling one that had been forming since their encounter in the conservatory. The Duke of Ravenswood, for reasons she couldn't begin to comprehend, had singled her out for attention, and what's more, he seemed to know things about her that he shouldn't, like her private study of Portuguese literature, a passion she had shared with no one but her family. When the gentlemen rejoined the ladies, Harriet deliberately positioned herself within a group of chattering young women, making it difficult for anyone to approach her directly. She felt the Duke's presence the moment he entered the room, an awareness that both thrilled and unsettled her. To her relief, he made no attempt to seek her out, instead engaging Lord Whitmore in what appeared to be a serious discussion near the fireplace. Only once did his gaze find hers across the room, and the intensity she found there made her breath catch. As the evening drew to a close, Harriet and her parents prepared to depart. They were in the entrance hall, waiting for their carriage to be brought round, when the Duke appeared at her elbow. "Miss Donovan," he said with a formal bow, "I trust you enjoyed the evening." "It was memorable, Your Grace," she replied carefully. "Indeed." That almost smile again. "I hope I didn't discomfit you at dinner." "Not at all," she lied, "though I admit to curiosity about your choice of language." "Do you? How interesting." His eyes gleamed with something that might have been amusement. "Perhaps next time I'll speak in Italian. I understand you're quite fluent." Before she could respond to this new evidence of his inexplicable knowledge of her, he bowed again and turned to her father. "Westfield, a pleasure as always. I wonder if I might call on you tomorrow. There's a matter I wish to discuss." Harriet's father looked startled but quickly recovered. "Of course, Your Grace. We'd be honored." The Duke's eyes flicked to Harriet once more. "Until tomorrow, then." As their carriage rolled through London's darkened streets, Harriet's mind raced with questions. Why would the Duke of Ravenswood, one of the most powerful men in England, take such an interest in her? What had he meant by, "Finally, I found you"? And most puzzling of all, how did he know about her private scholarly pursuits? "He wishes to call tomorrow," her mother said, breaking the silence. Her tone was carefully neutral, but Harriet could hear the underlying excitement. "How interesting." "Indeed," her father agreed. "Though what business he could have with us, I cannot imagine." But Harriet could imagine, and the possibility both terrified and exhilarated her. For the first time in 7 seasons, she found herself looking forward to the morrow with something other than resignation. The following afternoon found Harriet unusually particular about her appearance. She had changed her gown 3 times, before settling on a simple day dress of deep emerald that complemented her auburn hair. Not that she was trying to impress the Duke, she told herself firmly. She merely wished to present herself with appropriate dignity. "You look lovely, dear," her mother said, entering Harriet's bedchamber, "though I can't recall the last time you wore that particular shade." "It's not too much?" Harriet asked, smoothing the skirt nervously. Her mother smiled knowingly. "Not at all. It brings out the gold in your eyes." Downstairs, they found the Earl in his study, reviewing correspondence. "Your mother tells me you've taken unusual care with your appearance today," he said without looking up. "I always strive to be presentable," Harriet replied primly. Her father's eyes, so like her own, twinkled with amusement. "Of course, it has nothing to do with our expected visitor." Before Harriet could form a suitably dignified response, their butler, Simmons, appeared at the door. His Grace the Duke of Ravenswood, he announced, with a gravity befitting the visitor's rank. Sebastian Goddard entered the room with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to command. He was dressed impeccably, in a dark blue coat that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, buff breeches, and polished Hessian boots. His cravat was tied in a simple style that somehow managed to look more elegant than the elaborate confections favored by society's dandies. "Your Grace," the Earl said, rising to greet their guest. "Welcome to Westfield House." "Thank you for receiving me on such short notice," the Duke replied, bowing to the Countess before turning to Harriet. His eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than was strictly proper. "Miss Donovan." "Your Grace," she responded with a curtsy, fighting to keep her voice steady. Once they were settled, with tea served and initial pleasantries exchanged, the Earl leaned forward slightly. "You mentioned a matter you wished to discuss?" "Indeed." The Duke set down his teacup with deliberate care. "I'll come directly to the point. As I have no taste for unnecessary circumlocution, I have come to request permission to court your daughter." The silence that followed his declaration was absolute. Harriet felt as though all the air had been sucked from the room. Surely she had misheard. Her father recovered first. "I see. This is rather unexpected. For you, perhaps," the Duke said, his calm demeanor unruffled. "For me, it is the culmination of a long period of observation and consideration." "You've been observing our daughter?" the Countess asked, her tone somewhere between flattered and concerned. "Since her debut," he confirmed, echoing what he had told Harriet in the conservatory. "I found her immediately intriguing, intelligent, composed, and refreshingly genuine in a society that prizes artifice above all else." "But you never approached her," the Earl pointed out. "Not once in 7 seasons. I had obligations that kept me away from London for extended periods," the Duke explained, "and I wish to be certain. Marriage is not a step I take lightly." "Marriage?" Harriet blurted, finding her voice at last. "Your Grace, we've scarcely exchanged 24 sentences." His gaze, when it turned to her, held an intensity that made her breath catch. "Quality of conversation matters more than quantity, Miss Donovan. Besides, I know far more about you than you might imagine." "So it would seem," she replied, remembering his knowledge of her linguistic studies, "though how that could be, I cannot fathom." A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Your father and mine were at Oxford together. Did you know?" The Earl nodded slowly. "We were acquainted, though not particularly close. Different circles. Nevertheless, he remembered you with respect," the Duke continued. "When I inherited the title, I made it my business to know the character of every significant family in England. Yours stood out for its integrity, a rare commodity in our society." "That explains your knowledge of our family," Harriet said, "but not your specific interest in me." "Doesn't it?" he countered. "A family of substance and principle might be expected to raise a daughter of similar quality. When I observed you at your debut, standing apart, watching the proceedings with intelligent eyes, rather than throwing yourself into the fray, my interest was piqued." "You've been watching me for 7 years," she said slowly, trying to make sense of it. "From a distance." "Not always from a distance," he corrected. "We've been in the same room on numerous occasions. You attended the Millingham's Musicale in 14, where you demonstrated remarkable patience during Lady Caroline's butchering of Mozart. You visit the British Museum on the first Tuesday of each month, where you linger longest in the antiquities section. And you walk in Hyde Park every morning when the weather permits, accompanied only by your lady's maid." Harriet stared at him, unnerved by this catalogue of her movements. "Your Grace, forgive me, but this borders on impropriety," he suggested. "Perhaps, but I assure you my interest has always been honourable." "It's rather unconventional," her father said diplomatically. "I am an unconventional man, my lord." The Duke's tone remained even. "And your daughter, if you'll forgive my presumption, is an unconventional woman. She reads Wollstonecraft and Portuguese poetry. She corresponds with scholars under her father's name because they wouldn't take a woman's intellect seriously. She has rejected multiple offers of marriage because she values her independence and intelligence too much to sacrifice them for security alone." Harriet's parents exchanged startled glances. Even they hadn't known the full extent of her scholarly pursuits. "How could you possibly know all this?" Harriet demanded. a mixture of indignation and fascination coursing through her. For the first time, the Duke appeared slightly uncomfortable. I have resources at my disposal, and an interest in ensuring that my future Duchess would be a woman of substance, as well as breeding. You investigated me, she said flatly. I learned about you, he corrected gently. There's a difference. The Earl cleared his throat. While your interest in our daughter is flattering, Your Grace, I must consider her feelings in this matter. Harriet is not a political alliance or a business transaction. I'm well aware of that, my lord. For the first time, a trace of emotion coloured the Duke's voice. If she were, I would have married years ago. I seek a partner, not a possession. And if I don't wish to be courted? Harriet asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Sebastian Goddard regarded her steadily. Then I will respect your decision, Miss Donovan. I have no desire to pursue an unwilling woman. But I ask only that you give me the opportunity to present myself properly, not as the Duke of Ravenswood, but as the man I am when the weight of that title is set aside. Something in his tone, a note of genuine vulnerability beneath the confident exterior, touched Harriet in a way she hadn't expected. I would need time to consider, she said carefully. Of course. He inclined his head. Though I hope you'll permit me to call again tomorrow. There is something I wish to show you, something that might help you understand my interest more clearly. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. Very well, Your Grace. Sebastian, he reminded her quietly, when we're among friends. After the Duke had departed, Harriet faced her parents' curious gazes. Well, her mother said, barely containing her excitement, this is a most unexpected development. Indeed, her father agreed, his expression more thoughtful. The Duke of Ravenswood, I never would have predicted it. Nothing has been decided, Harriet reminded them firmly. This could very well be some peculiar whim on his part. A 7-year whim? Her mother countered. I think not. Besides, you could do far worse than a duke who has clearly gone to considerable lengths to understand you. Or a duke who has been investigating me without my knowledge or consent, Harriet pointed out. It's rather unsettling. Perhaps, her father conceded, but his intentions appear honourable, and he was forthright about his methods, however unconventional. What will you wear tomorrow? Her mother asked, already moving on to practical considerations. Harriet sighed. I haven't decided if I'm receiving him yet. Both her parents looked at her with identical expressions of disbelief. Very well, she admitted. The blue walking dress, I suppose, if we're to go out. That night, Harriet lay awake long past midnight, her mind whirling with questions. The Duke's interest in her defied all logic. She was neither the most beautiful nor the most accomplished young woman of her season. Her dowry, while respectable, was certainly not exceptional enough to attract a man of his wealth. And her age, 26, practically an antique in the marriage market, should have disqualified her entirely. Yet he had watched her for 7 years, learned her habits, her intellectual pursuits, even her private correspondence. It should have frightened her, this silent observation. Instead, she found herself oddly moved by the thought that someone had seen her, truly seen her, when she had spent so long trying to be invisible. Finalmente, you are encontré, she whispered into the darkness. Finally, I found you. The words echoed in her mind, spoken in his deep voice with perfect pronunciation. What did he see in her that others had missed? And what did he intend to show her tomorrow? Sleep claimed her eventually, but her dreams were filled with grey eyes that seemed to see through all her carefully constructed defences. The Duke arrived promptly at 10 the following morning, dressed for riding in a well-cut coat that emphasised his broad shoulders without the excessive padding favoured by fashionable gentlemen. He brought with him a small leather-bound volume, which he presented to Harriet with a formal bow. "What is this?" she asked, accepting the book and opening it carefully. Inside, she found Portuguese poetry, rare works she had been attempting to locate for years. "A small token," he said. "I recalled your interest in Lusitanian verse." "This is extraordinary," she admitted, turning the pages with reverent fingers. "Some of these works aren't available even in the finest libraries in London. I have connections in Lisbon," he explained. "When I learned of your interest, I made inquiries." "Before we had ever spoken?" she asked, looking up at him in wonder. A faint smile touched his lips. "As I said, Miss Donovan, I have been observing you for some time." "Harriet," she corrected, then blushed at her forwardness. "If we are to be friends," As you suggested. His smile deepened, revealing a dimple in his left cheek that transformed his austere features. Harriet, then. And you must call me Sebastian, at least when we're not in formal company. Sebastian, she tested the name, finding she liked the way it felt on her tongue. Thank you for the book. It's a thoughtful gift. It's merely a prelude, he said. If you're amenable, I've arranged something that I think might interest you. Curiosity piqued, Harriet agreed to accompany him on an outing, properly chaperoned by her lady's maid. To her surprise, their carriage, an elegant but understated conveyance bearing the Ravenswood crest, delivered them not to a park or exhibition, but to a modest townhouse in a respectable but unfashionable neighborhood. "Where are we?" she asked, as a footman helped her descend from the carriage. "A place few members of society ever see," Sebastian replied, offering his arm. "But one I think you, of all people, will appreciate." The door was opened by a severe-looking woman in her 50s, who bowed formally to Sebastian before ushering them into a small entrance hall. "Your Grace," she said, "everything is prepared as you requested." "Thank you, Mrs. Winters. May I present Miss Harriet Donovan? Harriet, this is Mrs. Winters, who oversees this establishment." The woman curtsied to Harriet. "An honor, Miss Donovan. We've heard much about you." Before Harriet could inquire exactly what they had heard, Sebastian guided her through to a large, well-lit room where a most extraordinary sight greeted her. A dozen young women, ranging in age from perhaps 14 to 20, seated at desks with books open before them. At the front of the room, a bespectacled gentleman was explaining what appeared to be a mathematical concept. The lesson paused as they entered, the girls rising respectfully. "Please continue," Sebastian said with a wave of his hand. "We'll observe from the back." As the lesson resumed, he leaned close to whisper in Harriet's ear. "What do you see?" "Girls, studying mathematics," she replied, mystified. "Advanced mathematics by the look of it." "Indeed." There was a note of pride in his voice. "And in the next room they study natural philosophy. In another, languages and literature, including your beloved Portuguese." "I don't understand," she admitted. "What is this place?" "A school," he said simply, "for girls of intelligence and potential who lack the advantages of birth or fortune." Harriet looked around with new eyes, noting the quality of the books, the excellent lighting, the comfortable but practical furnishings. "You established this?" 5 years ago. His expression was serious now, all traces of the aristocratic hauteur he wore in society gone. "After my sister died." "Your sister?" Harriet echoed, surprised. She had never heard mention of a sister. "Eleanor," he said softly, "brilliant, much like you. She had a mind for mathematics that would have put Cambridge scholars to shame had she been born male and permitted to study there." Understanding began to dawn. "This school is in her memory." "Yes." His grey eyes held hers. "She died young, just 20, of a fever. Before she did, she made me promise not to waste my position and privilege. To use it to make a difference, particularly for women of intellect who are so often overlooked or actively discouraged. That's why you noticed me," Harriet said slowly. "I reminded you of her." "In some ways," he acknowledged, "but my interest in you is entirely different, I assure you." The intensity of his gaze left no doubt as to his meaning. They moved through the school, Sebastian introducing her to teachers and students alike, all of whom clearly held him in high regard. It was a side of the Duke that society never saw, warm, engaged, genuinely invested in these young women's futures. "We provide not only education but connections," he explained, as they observed a class on proper business correspondence. "Many of our graduates have secured positions as governesses in good families or as companions to elderly ladies of quality. Some have even gone on to establish small businesses of their own, a lending library, a milliner's shop, a translation service." "It's remarkable," Harriet said, genuinely impressed. "But why keep it secret? This could serve as an example to others of your station." Sebastian's expression darkened slightly. "Society is not ready to accept women's education so openly, particularly among the lower classes. There are those who would see this as dangerous, a disruption of the natural order. My position protects the school, but only if it remains relatively unknown. And now you've shown it to me," she said, understanding the significance of his trust. "Why?" He led her to a small private sitting room where tea had been laid out. Once they were seated, With her maid positioned discreetly by the door, he leaned forward. "Because I wanted you to understand why I've watched you all these years," he said frankly. "When I saw you at your debut, calm, observant, clearly possessing a mind that society had no real use for, I recognized something of Eleanor in you. But as I learned more, I came to appreciate you for yourself. So your interest began as a project?" Harriet asked, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. "Another intelligent woman to save from society's limitations?" "No," he said firmly. "My admiration was immediate and personal. But I needed to be sure that you were as I perceived you to be, a woman of substance who would not merely tolerate my unconventional interests, but share them. A potential partner, not just in marriage but in purpose." Harriet considered this, turning the teacup in her hands. "You speak of marriage so easily, yet we scarcely know each other, don't we?" His smile was gentle. "I know that you rise early to read before the house is awake, that you prefer coffee to tea, but drink the latter because your mother disapproves of the former as unladylike, that you keep a journal in which you write not gossip or romantic fantasies, but observations on society, politics, and literature that would rival any published critic." She stared at him, torn between indignation at this invasion of privacy and a strange growing warmth at being so thoroughly seen and understood. "And what do I know of you?" she challenged, "beyond your title and this secret philanthropy?" "A fair question." He set down his cup. "What would you like to know?" "Everything," she said simply. And so he told her of his childhood at Ravenswood Hall, his education at Eton and Oxford, his father's early death that thrust the dukedom upon him at just 24, of diplomatic missions during the war that could never be publicly acknowledged, of his frustration with society's emphasis on appearance over substance, of his determination to use his position for meaningful change rather than mere self-indulgence. "I have never fit comfortably within Ton society," he admitted. "I find most of its preoccupations trivial and its conversations insipid, which is why, when I observed you standing apart at that first ball, watching the proceedings with that same mixture of tolerance and detachment that I felt myself, you immediately caught my attention. And you've been watching me ever since," she mused, "gathering information, learning my habits and interests." "I prefer to think of it as coming to know you," he corrected gently, "in the only way available to me, given the constraints of society and my own responsibilities that kept me often from London." "Why not approach me directly?" she asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since his first declaration. Sebastian looked slightly uncomfortable for the first time. "At first it was because I wasn't certain. Marriage for someone in my position is not merely a personal choice but a political and social one. I needed to be sure." "And later," she pressed. "Later, I was afraid," he admitted, the confession clearly costing him. "Afraid that the woman I had built in my mind, the Harriet Donovan I had come to admire from afar, might not match the reality, that you might be disappointed in me, or I in you, that the connection I imagined might not exist when we actually conversed." His honesty touched her deeply. This powerful man, feared and respected throughout England, admitting to fear of rejection by her, a spinster of 7 seasons whom society had long since dismissed. "And now?" she asked softly. "Having spoken with me, do you find the reality disappointing?" His eyes, when they met hers, held such warmth that it stole her breath. "Quite the opposite. The reality of you, Harriet Donovan, far exceeds even my most hopeful imaginings." A silence fell between them, charged with possibility. "I still have many questions," she said finally. "Of course, and I promise to answer them all, in time." He hesitated, then reached across to take her hand. The touch, though proper with her gloves and his, sent a tremor through her. "But for now I ask only this. Will you allow me to court you properly, to show you not just who I am but who we might be together?" Harriet looked into his eyes, intelligent, intense, and now vulnerable in a way she would never have expected from the formidable Duke of Ravenswood, and made her decision. "Yes," she said simply, "I would like that very much. Sebastian." His answering smile was like the sun breaking through clouds, transforming his severe features into something breathtaking in its beauty and warmth. As they left the school, returning to the carriage that would take them back to the world of society and its rigid expectations, Harriet felt as though she had stepped into an entirely new life, one where she was not invisible or overlooked, but seen, valued, and perhaps even cherished. "What happens now?" she asked as the carriage rolled through London's streets. "Now," Sebastian said, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. "We scandalize society by dancing together at Lady Richmond's ball tomorrow night." "Is that wise?" she asked, though the prospect sent a thrill through her. "It will cause talk." "Let them talk," he replied with a dismissive wave. "I've never cared for society's opinion, and I suspect you haven't either. Besides," he added with a hint of mischief that made him look years younger, "I've waited 7 years to dance with you, Harriet Donovan. I don't intend to wait a day longer." Lady Richmond's annual spring ball was the highlight of the London season, an event where reputations were made or broken with a single invitation, or lack thereof. The ballroom was a sea of silk and satin, jewels catching the light of 1,000 candles, as England's elite manoeuvred for position and advantage. Harriet entered on her father's arm, her mother following close behind. For the first time in 7 seasons, she felt a flutter of genuine anticipation rather than dutiful resignation. "You look beautiful tonight, my dear," her father murmured, as they paused at the entrance to the ballroom. She had chosen her gown with unusual care, a silk creation in deep sapphire blue that complemented her auburn hair and fair complexion. It was more daring than her usual selections, with an embroidered bodice that emphasized her slender waist and a neckline that, while still entirely proper, was lower than she typically favored. "Thank you, father," she replied, scanning the crowd with greater interest than she had shown in years. She spotted him immediately, standing near a column, his height and bearing setting him apart from the crowd. Sebastian wore formal evening attire, the severe black and white somehow more striking on him than the colourful finery adorning other gentlemen. As if sensing her presence, he turned, his eyes finding hers across the crowded room. The intensity of his gaze, even at a distance, sent a shiver down her spine. He inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, the barest hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "The Duke has arrived, I see," her mother observed with poorly concealed excitement. Since Sebastian's declaration of intent to court Harriet, the Countess had vacillated between disbelief and delight. "How attentive he looks." "Indeed," her father agreed, his tone more measured. Though pleased by the match, the Earl remained cautious, concerned about the scrutiny his daughter would face as the object of the Duke's sudden interest. They moved further into the ballroom, accepting greetings from acquaintances. Harriet noted the speculative glances cast her way. Word of Sebastian's visit to Westfield House had clearly spread. "Miss Donovan," came a familiar voice. Lady Elizabeth Norwood, Harriet's cousin, approached with barely contained excitement. "You must tell me everything at once." "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Harriet replied primly, though she couldn't suppress a small smile. "Don't play coy," Elizabeth chided, lowering her voice to a whisper. "The Duke of Ravenswood called on your family 2 days ago, and again yesterday. The entire ton is abuzz with speculation." "Is it?" Harriet asked mildly. "How tedious for them to have so little of interest in their own lives," Elizabeth laughed. "Oh, you are impossible, but you must admit it's rather extraordinary. 7 seasons without a serious suitor, and suddenly the most eligible bachelor in England appears at your door." "There have been suitors," Harriet corrected, "simply none I cared to encourage." "Until now," Elizabeth observed shrewdly. "You're wearing the sapphire earrings Aunt Barbara saves for special occasions, and that gown is decidedly more flattering than your usual selections." Harriet felt heat rise to her cheeks. "The gown was your recommendation last season, if you recall." "Which you declined to wear until tonight," her cousin pointed out triumphantly. "Admit it, you wish to make an impression." Before Harriet could formulate a suitably dignified response, a hush fell over their immediate vicinity. She turned to find Sebastian approaching, his expression as unreadable as ever to most observers. But Harriet, now attuned to the subtle shifts in his demeanor, noted the warmth in his eyes as they met hers. "Miss Donovan," he said, bowing formally. "You look enchanting this evening." "Your Grace," she replied with a curtsy, aware of the many eyes upon them. "How kind of you to say so." Not kindness, but simple truth. He turned to Elizabeth, who was watching the exchange with undisguised fascination. "Lady Elizabeth, a pleasure to see you again." "Your Grace," Elizabeth managed, dropping into a curtsy. "How unexpected to see you at Lady Richmond's ball. You so rarely attend such functions." "I found I had reason to make an exception this evening," he replied, his gaze returning to Harriet. "Miss Donovan, I believe the next set is about to begin. Might I have the honor?" A collective intake of breath seemed to ripple through the nearby guests. The Duke of Ravenswood, who had famously danced with no one but the occasional foreign princess or daughter of a duke for the past decade, was requesting a set with Miss Harriet Donovan, a spinster of 7 seasons, with no particular claim to beauty or fortune. "I would be delighted, Your Grace," Harriet replied, placing her gloved hand on his proffered arm. As he led her toward the dance floor, she was acutely aware of the stares following them, the whispered comments behind fans and raised hands. "You've caused quite a stir," she murmured, as they took their positions for the quadrille. "Have I?" He seemed genuinely unconcerned. "I merely asked a beautiful woman to dance. Surely that's not so extraordinary." "It is when the gentleman in question is known for avoiding the dance floor as though it were plagued with the pox," she replied with a small smile. He laughed, a rich, genuine sound that drew even more stares. "Perhaps I simply needed the right partner to tempt me." The music began, and Harriet found herself swept into the intricate patterns of the dance. Sebastian moved with unexpected grace for a man of his size, leading her through the steps with confident precision. When their hands met, even through the barrier of gloves, she felt that same jolt of awareness that had surprised her in the conservatory. "You dance beautifully," he said, during a moment when the figures of the dance brought them close together. "As I knew you would." "You seem very certain of many things about me," she observed, for a man who claimed to fear disappointment in the reality. His lips quirked in that almost smile that was becoming increasingly familiar. "Some things one can observe from a distance. The grace with which you move, for instance, the intelligence in your eyes, the gentle firmness with which you declined Lord Hathaway's son when he stepped on your hem and tore it at the Millingham's ball 3 seasons ago." "You saw that?" she asked, surprised. She had forgotten the incident entirely. "I told you, Harriet," he said, his voice dropping to an intimate murmur as they circled each other. "I have been watching you for a very long time." The dance separated them again, but his words lingered, warming her from within despite the impropriety of such open admiration. When the set ended, Sebastian escorted her back to her mother's side, where a small crowd of acquaintances had gathered, clearly hoping to glean some insight into this unexpected development. "Your Grace," Lady Whitmore said, her tone overly bright, "how delightful to see you so engaged in the festivities." "Indeed," he replied non-committally. "Miss Donovan is an excellent partner." "How unexpected," Lady Jersey commented, her sharp eyes moving between Sebastian and Harriet. As one of society's primary arbiters, her opinion could make or break a reputation. "I wasn't aware you were acquainted." "Our families have known each other for years," Sebastian said smoothly. "The Earl and my late father were at Oxford together." This was true, if somewhat misleading in its implication of a long-standing connection between the families. "How fascinating," Lady Jersey replied, clearly unconvinced. "And yet I don't recall seeing you dance with Miss Donovan in previous seasons." "My loss entirely," Sebastian said with a slight bow to Harriet. "A mistake I intend to rectify this evening, if Miss Donovan will honor me with another set later." "I would be pleased to, Your Grace," Harriet replied, amazed at her own composure in the face of such scrutiny. As the evening progressed, Sebastian remained attentive, claiming Harriet for 2 more dances, a waltz during which his hand at her waist sent shivers up her spine, and a country dance that allowed for brief snatches of private conversation. Between sets, he brought her refreshments and introduced her to several of his closest associates, treating her with a deference that left no doubt as to his serious intentions. Not everyone viewed the developing relationship with approval. Harriet became aware of whispers following her around the ballroom, speculation about what arts she had employed to capture the interest of England's most eligible bachelor, insinuations that her family must have engineered some form of compromise, and unkind comments about a desperate spinster, clutching at one final chance for matrimony. During a moment when Sebastian had been drawn into conversation with Lord Liverpool, Harriet retreated to a quiet alcove, needing a moment to compose herself. The weight of society's attention after years of comfortable invisibility, was more taxing than she had anticipated. "Miss Donovan," came a familiar voice. "What a spectacle you've made of yourself this evening." Harriet turned to find Lady Caroline Berkeley, a contemporary from her debut season, who had married a wealthy baronet in her first year out. Never particularly friendly, Caroline had grown increasingly bitter over the years as her beauty faded and her marriage proved less advantageous than anticipated. "Lady Berkeley," Harriet acknowledged with a polite nod. "I trust you're enjoying the ball?" "Immensely," Caroline replied with a thin smile. "It's not every day one witnesses such a desperate display. The Duke of Ravenswood, of all people." "Really, Harriet? What did you do to capture his attention?" "I believe that's between His Grace and myself," Harriet said evenly. Caroline leaned closer, dropping her voice to a venomous whisper. "You do realize he's merely amusing himself. Men of his station often develop peculiar tastes. The challenge of the overlooked spinster, perhaps. But he won't marry you, my dear. He can't possibly." Though the words stung, Harriet maintained her composure. "So how fortunate that I have your expertise on the Duke's intentions to guide me. I had only his direct statements to rely upon." Caroline's eyes narrowed. "You always did think yourself above the rest of us with your books and languages. But a pretty face and a fresh young body will always trump intelligence in a man's eyes, and you, my dear, possess neither." Before Harriet could respond to this cruelty, a deep voice interrupted them. "Lady Berkeley," Sebastian said, his tone glacial. "I trust you're not monopolizing Miss Donovan's attention. I believe we're engaged for the next set." Caroline paled, clearly uncertain how much he had overheard. "Your Grace," she managed, dropping into a curtsy. "I was just reminiscing with Miss Donovan about our debut season, such a long time ago now." "Indeed," he replied coldly, "if you'll excuse us." Taking Harriet's arm, he led her away from the alcove, his expression thunderous. "What did she say to upset you?" he asked once they were out of earshot. "Nothing of consequence," Harriet assured him, though the barbs had struck deeper than she cared to admit. "Merely the predictable reactions of society to anything unexpected." Sebastian's jaw tightened. "I heard enough to guess the rest. She suggested I couldn't possibly have serious intentions toward you." "Something to that effect," Harriet acknowledged. "And do you believe her?" he asked, stopping to face her directly, his grey eyes intense. "I don't know what to believe," she admitted honestly. "This is all so sudden, so unexpected. A week ago, I was resigned to spinsterhood and a future as my aunt's companion. Now the most sought-after bachelor in England claims to have been watching me for years, speaks to me in Portuguese, shows me his secret school, and dances with me 3 times at the most important ball of the season. It's rather a lot to comprehend." His expression softened. "I understand, and I've done you no favors by being so public in my attentions before you've had time to adjust to them privately. For that I apologize." "There's no need," she assured him. "I'm simply unaccustomed to being the center of attention." "Would you prefer we leave?" he asked. "I have no wish to distress you." Harriet considered the offer, tempted by the thought of escaping the curious stares and malicious whispers. But then she recalled Caroline's smug certainty that Sebastian couldn't possibly be serious about someone like her. Something stubborn kindled in her chest. "No," she said firmly. "We will stay, and we will dance again, if you're still willing." A slow smile spread across his face. A full, genuine smile this time, not the restrained, almost smile he usually allowed himself. More than willing. As they took their places for the next set, Harriet felt a curious sense of liberation. Let them stare. Let them whisper. For the first time in her life, she was precisely where she wanted to be with a man who saw her, truly saw her, when everyone else had looked past her for years. The evening continued, a blend of exhilaration and scrutiny that left Harriet both exhausted and strangely energized by the time her father signaled that they should depart. Sebastian escorted them to their carriage, bowing over Harriet's hand with a lingering touch that sent warmth coursing through her. "Until tomorrow," he murmured for her ears alone. "Tomorrow," she echoed, pleasantly surprised. "I thought perhaps a drive in the park, if the weather permits," he suggested. "I find I'm increasingly impatient for your company." The admission, so simply stated, touched her deeply. "I would like that very much." As their carriage rolled away, Harriet caught a final glimpse of him standing on the steps of Lady Richmond's townhouse, his tall figure illuminated by the torches flanking the entrance. He was watching her departure with an intensity that made her heart flutter in a most undignified manner for a woman of 26. "Well," her mother said once they were underway, barely containing her excitement, "that was most promising." "The Duke seemed quite attentive," her father agreed, though his tone held a note of caution. "Perhaps too attentive, given how recently you've become acquainted." "We've been acquainted for years, according to him," Harriet pointed out. "Just not conversationally." "Yes, this business of him observing you," her father frowned slightly. "It's rather unusual." "Everything about the situation is unusual," Harriet acknowledged, "but I find I don't mind it as much as I perhaps should." Her mother reached across to pat her hand. "Of course you don't. He's a duke, my dear. And not just any duke. The Duke of Ravenswood, a man of immense wealth and influence." "That's not why I—" Harriet began, then stopped herself. How could she explain that it wasn't Sebastian's title or fortune that intrigued her, but the man himself? The intelligence in his grey eyes, the unexpected warmth of his smile when he allowed it to emerge, the passion with which he spoke of education and purpose, the vulnerability he had revealed in admitting his fears of disappointment. "I know, dear," her mother said, misinterpreting her hesitation. "It's all happening very quickly, but at 26, perhaps quick is best." "Your mother means well," her father said with a gentle smile. "But what matters is your happiness, Harriet. Do you believe the Duke could make you happy?" Harriet considered the question seriously. "I hardly know him," she said finally, "and yet I feel as though he knows me, sees me in a way no one else ever has." "Then I suggest you take the time to know him in return," her father advised. "A courtship, even an expedited one, should allow for that." Over the following weeks, Harriet discovered that there was indeed much more to Sebastian Goddard than the austere, forbidding Duke of Ravenswood that society knew. Their daily drives in the park, always properly chaperoned, but still allowing for private conversation, revealed a man of profound intellect, dry wit, and surprising compassion. He spoke to her of his diplomatic work during the war, not the details which remained state secrets, but the principles that had guided him, a deep belief in justice, a commitment to preventing needless suffering, a vision of an England that lived up to its highest ideals rather than its basest impulses. She told him of her scholarly pursuits, her frustrations with the limitations placed on women, her dreams of meaningful contribution beyond the narrow confines of marriage and motherhood. Rather than dismissing these aspirations, as every other man of her acquaintance would have done, he engaged with them seriously, offering insights and occasionally challenging her assumptions in ways that led to spirited but respectful debates. Their courtship did not go unnoticed or unremarked upon. The Tun buzzed with speculation and gossip. Some, particularly those with unmarried daughters who had hoped to attract the Duke's attention, were openly hostile. Others were merely curious, watching the developing relationship with the avid interest of theatregoers at a particularly unexpected play. Sebastian, true to his word, paid no attention to society's opinions. He called at Westfield House daily, escorted Harriet to exhibitions and concerts, and danced with her at every ball they attended. His preference for her company was so marked and so exclusive that within a fortnight the question was no longer whether he would offer for her, but when. "You've transformed the most confirmed bachelor in England," Elizabeth remarked during a morning call 3 weeks after Lady Richmond's ball. "The betting books at White's are heavily favouring an announcement before the end of the season." "How vulgar," Harriet replied, though without much heat. She had grown accustomed to being the subject of speculation. "And how presumptuous. His Grace has expressed interest in a courtship, nothing more." Elizabeth gave her a knowing look. "My dear cousin, the man has eyes for no one but you. He declined Lady Harrington's dinner invitation because you weren't included. He endured an entire evening of Lady Jersey's musical protégés screeching through Italian arias because you enjoy music. If that's not a man on the brink of a proposal, I don't know what is." Harriet couldn't deny the evidence of Sebastian's devotion, yet something held her back from fully embracing the possibility of a future as the Duchess of Ravenswood. Perhaps it was the lingering doubt planted by Caroline Berkeley's cruel words, or perhaps it was simply the speed with which her life had transformed from quiet resignation to the center of society's attention. That afternoon, Sebastian arrived for their customary drive with an air of barely suppressed excitement. "I have a proposition," he said once they were settled in his carriage, her maid positioned discreetly opposite them. "My estate in Derbyshire, Ravenswood Hall, is at its most beautiful in early summer. I thought perhaps you and your family might consider visiting for a week or two. Lady Harrington has agreed to act as hostess, to ensure all proprieties are observed." "Ravenswood Hall," Harriet echoed, surprised by the invitation. It was a significant step. An invitation to his ancestral home, with her family included, suggested serious intentions indeed. "I would like you to see it," he said, his expression earnest, "to know if you could be happy there." The implication was clear, and Harriet felt her heart quicken. I'll need to consult with my parents, of course." "Of course," he agreed. "But I hope they'll consent. There's something else I'd like to show you, something that exists only at Ravenswood." "Another secret school?" she asked with a small smile. His answering smile was warm. "Not exactly, but something I believe will help you understand why I've been so certain about you, even from a distance." Intrigued by the cryptic statement, Harriet broached the subject with her parents that evening. To her surprise, they had already received and accepted a formal invitation from Sebastian. "Lady Harrington will be there as hostess," her mother assured her, along with several other respectable couples. "Everything will be perfectly proper. And it will give us an opportunity to better know the Duke in his own environment," her father added, "to see how he manages his estate, how he treats his dependents. These things tell you far more about a man's character than his behavior in London drawing rooms." And so, a fortnight later, Harriet found herself in a well-sprung travelling carriage journeying north toward Derbyshire. Sebastian had gone ahead several days earlier to ensure all was prepared for their arrival, a separation that had left her feeling strangely bereft after weeks of daily contact. As they crossed into Derbyshire, the landscape changed, becoming more dramatic, rolling hills giving way to steeper inclines, lush valleys, and the occasional glimpse of rugged peaks in the distance. By the time they turned onto a private road marked with the Ravenswood crest, Harriet was filled with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Nothing, however, prepared her for her first sight of Ravenswood Hall. The house rose from a gentle hill, like something from a fairy tale, a magnificent stone structure with turrets and gables, surrounded by formal gardens that gave way to parkland dotted with ancient oaks. A small lake gleamed in the afternoon sun, and beyond it the land rose again toward distant moorland. "Goodness," her mother breathed as their carriage approached along the sweeping drive. "It's like a palace." "One of the finest estates in England," her father agreed, "and one of the most profitable from what I understand. The Duke has modernized the home farm extensively." Harriet barely registered their comments, her attention fixed on the figure standing at the top of the grand entrance steps. Even at a distance, she recognized Sebastian immediately, his height, his bearing, the way he stood perfectly still, yet somehow conveyed contained energy. As their carriage drew to a halt, a small army of livened servants appeared to assist with their arrival. Sebastian descended the steps to greet them personally, his usual reserve softened by evident pleasure. "Welcome to Ravenswood," he said, helping Harriet down from the carriage with gentle hands. "I trust your journey wasn't too fatiguing." "Not at all," she assured him, feeling unaccountably shy after their brief separation. "Your home is beautiful." "It's improved immeasurably with your presence," he replied quietly, offering his arm to escort her up the steps. The interior of Ravenswood Hall matched its impressive exterior, grand without being ostentatious, blending centuries of tradition with tasteful modern comforts. Lady Harrington greeted them in the entrance hall, along with several other guests who had arrived earlier. "Miss Donovan," Lady Harrington said with genuine warmth, "how delightful to have you join our little party. His Grace has spoken of nothing else since issuing the invitations." "You exaggerate, Lady Harrington," Sebastian protested mildly, though the fondness in his voice suggested a comfortable relationship. "I never exaggerate," the older woman replied with a wink at Harriet. "It would be most improper. Now, I'm sure our guests would appreciate time to refresh themselves after their journey. Shall we reconvene for tea in an hour?" Harriet was shown to an elegant suite of rooms in the east wing of the house, with windows overlooking the rose garden and, beyond it, the lake. The chambers had clearly been recently redecorated, with a color scheme of soft blues and greens that happened to be her favorites. His Grace had the rooms prepared especially, confided the maid assigned to assist her, said they had the best morning light for reading. This thoughtfulness, Sebastian considering her comfort, her preferences, even her reading habits, touched Harriet deeply. It was one thing to observe someone from a distance. It was quite another to translate that observation into such personalized consideration. After changing into a fresh gown, she joined the other guests for tea in a charming parlor, overlooking the formal gardens. Sebastian introduced her to those she hadn't yet met: a retired general and his wife, a scholarly vicar from the nearby village, and his sister, and Sebastian's cousin, Lord Henry Goddard, a jovial man whose ready wit immediately put Harriet at ease. "So you're the one who's finally captured my inscrutable cousin," Lord Henry said with a mischievous grin. "The entire family is agog with curiosity. Sebastian's never brought a young lady to Ravenswood before." "Henry," Sebastian warned, though without much heat. "Well, it's true," his cousin protested. "We'd begun to fear you'd follow in great-uncle Percival's footsteps and retreat entirely into academia and eccentricity. He kept a badger as a pet, you know," he added to Harriet in a stage whisper. "Named it Aristotle and taught it to fetch his slippers." "I assure you, I have no intention of keeping badgers," Sebastian said dryly, "Aristotelian or otherwise." The exchange, so different from Sebastian's usual formal interactions in London, revealed yet another facet of the man, one capable of humour and warmth within the circle of those he trusted. Harriet found herself warming to Lord Henry immediately, recognizing in him an ally who might help her understand the more private aspects of Sebastian's character. After tea, Sebastian suggested a walk in the gardens, as the late afternoon sun had broken through earlier clouds. Harriet readily agreed, eager for some time alone with him after the journey. "You seem comfortable here," she observed, as they strolled along a gravel path bordered by immaculate flower beds. "More so than in London." "This is home," he said simply. "London is where I must be for business and political matters, but Ravenswood is where I can be myself." "And who is that?" she asked. "The man behind the ducal title?" He considered the question seriously. "Someone rather ordinary, I suspect, despite the extraordinary circumstances of birth and position. A man who values intelligence over beauty, substance over style, and purpose over pleasure. Though I'm not opposed to pleasure when it's meaningful," he added with a glance that sent heat rising to her cheeks. They walked in companionable silence for a time, eventually reaching a small Greek-inspired temple overlooking the lake. Inside, a stone bench offered a place to rest and admire the view. "I used to come here as a boy," Sebastian said, his voice softer with reminiscence, "when the lessons and expectations and responsibilities seemed too much. My father was a good man, but a demanding one. He saw the dukedom as a sacred trust, a position of both privilege and obligation." "And you share that view," Harriet observed. "I do." He turned to face her directly. "Which is why I've been so deliberate in my approach to marriage. The woman who becomes Duchess of Ravenswood doesn't just share my bed and bear my children, though I hope very much for both," he added, with a frankness that made Harriet blush again. "She shares the obligation, the trust, the purpose." "That's a heavy burden to place on a wife," she said carefully. "It is," he acknowledged, "which is why I've waited so long to find a woman who could bear it, not as a burden, but as a calling of her own." His grey eyes held hers, intense and searching. "Tomorrow, if you're willing, I'd like to show you what I mentioned in London, the thing that exists only at Ravenswood. It might help you understand why I've been so certain about you, even from a distance." Curiosity piqued. Harriet nodded. "I'd like that very much." The following morning dawned clear and bright. After breakfast, Sebastian led Harriet to a wing of the house she hadn't yet explored. They climbed a spiral staircase to a tower room with windows on all sides, offering panoramic views of the estate. "This was originally a watchtower," Sebastian explained, producing a key to unlock a heavy oak door. "Built in more turbulent times, my great-grandfather converted it to a more peaceful purpose." The door swung open to reveal a sight that took Harriet's breath away, a magnificent library, circular in shape, with shelves reaching from floor to ceiling on all sides. A gallery ran around the upper level, accessible by a delicate wrought-iron spiral staircase. Comfortable reading chairs were positioned near the windows, and a massive desk occupied the center of the room, covered with papers, books, and what appeared to be correspondence. The Ravenswood Library, Sebastian said with evident pride. Over 20,000 volumes collected by generations of my family. But it's not the books themselves I wanted to show you, remarkable though they are. He led her to a section of shelving partially concealed behind the desk. This is the family archive. Journals, letters, and personal papers dating back to the first Duke. Each Ravenswood heir is encouraged to maintain the tradition of recording not just events but thoughts, reflections, the inner workings of the mind and heart. Selecting a volume bound in dark green leather, he handed it to Harriet. My father's journal from his time at Oxford, the entry for October 12, 1789. Curious, Harriet carefully opened the book to the date indicated and began to read. The handwriting was firm and precise, much like Sebastian's own. Met Robert Donovan today, a serious young man with a keen mind for mathematics. Unlike most of the fops and dandies that populate this place, he seems to genuinely value learning for its own sake. We had a fascinating discussion on Leibniz's calculus that left Hathaway and his crowd completely baffled. I sensed the beginning of a worthwhile acquaintance. Your father and mine, she said, looking up in surprise. They really were friends. More than I initially realized, Sebastian confirmed, selecting another volume. This is from 2 years later. This entry described a punting expedition on the river, during which her father had eloquently defended the radical notion that women were intellectually equal to men, a position that had nearly led to a fistfight with a particularly conservative fellow student. Donovan insists that his future daughters, should he be blessed with any, will receive the same education as any sons, the journal recorded. A progressive view that I find myself increasingly sympathetic to, despite my traditional upbringing. I had no idea, Harriet murmured, touched by this glimpse of her father's youthful idealism he had indeed put into practice in her education. There's more, Sebastian said, guiding her to a different shelf and selecting a slim volume bound in blue. This is from my own journal, kept during my first season in London after assuming the title. With hands that trembled slightly, Harriet opened it to the page he indicated. The entry was dated May 15, 1810, her debut ball. Endless parade of simpering debutantes tonight at the Hartington Ball. One exception, the Earl of Westfield's daughter, Miss Harriet Donovan. While the other young ladies fluttered and flirted, she observed the proceedings with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. There was something compelling about her composure, her quiet dignity amidst the social circus. When she did speak, primarily to her father, her expressions were animated, suggesting a lively mind behind the reserved demeanor. I find myself curious about her in a way I haven't been about any of the season's offerings. Perhaps because she reminds me of father's stories about her father, that same thoughtful quality, the sense of substance beneath the social veneer. Harriet stared at the page in wonder. You really did notice me, even then. I did, he confirmed. Though I wouldn't say I fell in love at first sight. Rather, I recognized something in you that resonated. A kindred spirit, perhaps. He guided her to a comfortable chair near the window, sitting opposite her. Over the years, my observations of you continued, recorded in these pages. Your dignity when faced with society's increasing dismissal as seasons passed without a match. Your intellectual pursuits, discovered through careful inquiry. Your kindness to those less fortunate, observed during your charity work at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. You documented all of this, Harriet asked, both flattered and slightly unnerved. Not in a systematic way, he assured her with a small smile. I'm not quite that obsessive, but yes, I noted impressions, observations, moments that confirmed my growing conviction that you were exceptional, not in the way society measures worth, but in the qualities I value most. He hesitated, then selected one final volume, newer than the others, its leather binding still fresh. This is from earlier this year, shortly before I determined to approach you directly. The entry was dated February 3rd, 1817. 7 years of observation, and still she intrigues me. Today at the British Museum, I watched Miss Donovan examine a newly arrived Egyptian artifact with such focused attention that the curator, thinking her a serious scholar rather than a society lady seeking entertainment, engaged her in detailed discussion about its provenance and significance. Her questions were insightful, her knowledge impressive. The curator never realized his error. so naturally did she inhabit the role of intellectual equal. And yet society sees only a spinster past her prime, a failure of the marriage market. Their blindness is my fortune, for it has left her unclaimed long enough for me to be certain. I am no longer concerned with political alliances or the expectations of the ton. At 31, I find myself longing for a partner of the mind as well as the heart. Harriet Donovan, with her quiet intelligence and hidden depths, increasingly seems the only possible choice. The question remains whether she would accept such an unconventional courtship from a man she knows only as the forbidding Duke of Ravenswood. Perhaps it's time to discover if the woman I've come to admire from afar could care for the man I truly am. Silence fell as Harriet finished reading, her heart full with the realization of how long and how deeply Sebastian had been considering her. It wasn't a whim or a peculiar fancy, as Caroline Barclay had suggested. It was the culmination of years of genuine admiration and thoughtful observation. "I wanted you to see these," Sebastian said quietly, "to understand that my interest isn't sudden or capricious, that when I say I know you, it's not merely a pretty phrase, but the truth. I've watched you grow from a reserved debutante into a woman of remarkable character and intellect. And in doing so, I have grown from a newly minted duke overwhelmed by responsibility into a man who knows his own mind and heart." He moved from his chair to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. "Harriet Donovan, I love you. Not the idealized version I created in my mind over years of distant observation, but the real woman I've come to know these past weeks. Your wit, your intelligence, your compassion, your quiet strength. I would be honored if you would consent to be my wife, my duchess, my partner in all things." Tears blurred Harriet's vision as she looked down at this powerful man kneeling before her, his usually guarded expression open and vulnerable. For a woman who had resigned herself to spinsterhood, who had watched friend after friend marry while she remained alone, who had begun to believe that no man would ever truly see and value her for herself, the moment seemed almost dreamlike in its perfection. "Sebastian," she said softly, his name a caress on her lips, "you know so much about me, and yet there's one thing you couldn't have observed from a distance." "What's that?" he asked, his grip on her hands tightening slightly. "That I have fallen completely, irrevocably in love with you," she confessed. "Not the Duke of Ravenswood that society knows, but the man you've allowed me to discover these past weeks. The man who builds schools for disadvantaged girls, who speaks Portuguese to surprise me, who remembers which books I linger over in the museum. Yes, Sebastian, yes, I will marry you." His face transformed with joy, years seeming to fall away, as he rose to pull her gently to her feet and into his arms. Their first kiss was tender, a sweet promise of deeper passion to come, but restrained by the respect he had always shown her. When they parted, both slightly breathless, Sebastian rested his forehead against hers. "Finalmente you a encontré," he murmured. "Finally I found you," she translated, smiling up at him. "But I think perhaps we found each other." The news of the engagement between His Grace, the Duke of Ravenswood, and Miss Harriet Donovan, daughter of the Earl of Westfield, was announced in the Morning Post the following week, setting London society abuzz with speculation and, in some quarters, consternation, that the most eligible bachelor in England had chosen a spinster of 7 seasons, a woman of unremarkable beauty and modest fortune, defied all conventional wisdom. "They're saying it won't last 6 months, Elizabeth reported during a visit to Westfield House, where Harriet had returned to prepare for the wedding. "That he'll tire of you once the novelty of an intelligent wife wears off, or that you've somehow tricked him, though no one can quite agree on how." "How flattering," Harriet remarked dryly, adjusting a piece of lace on the wedding gown being fitted by a seamstress. "And do you believe them?" "Of course not," her cousin replied indignantly. "Anyone who's seen the way he looks at you knows it's genuine, like you're the most fascinating creature he's ever encountered." "That's how he makes me feel," Harriet admitted softly, "as though everything about me, even the parts society deems undesirable in a woman, is precious to him." The wedding preparations proceeded with remarkable efficiency, guided by Sebastian's clear preference for a swift ceremony rather than a protracted engagement. The wedding itself would be held at Westminster Abbey, a privilege of Sebastian's rank that he insisted on exercising despite his usual dislike of ostentation. "If I must endure society's scrutiny," he told Harriet during one of his daily visits, I prefer to do so in a manner that leaves no doubt about the significance I attach to our union. You will enter the Abbey as Miss Donovan and emerge as the Duchess of Ravenswood with all the respect and deference that title commands." "I care nothing for the title," she assured him, touched by his protectiveness. "Only for the man who bears it." "Nevertheless," he said firmly, "I won't have anyone, from the highest peer to the lowest maid, doubting for a moment that you are my chosen Duchess, my equal in every way." The day of the wedding dawned clear and bright, as though even the notoriously fickle English weather recognized the significance of the occasion. Westminster Abbey was filled to capacity with peers of the realm, foreign dignitaries, and members of society who had secured invitations more from curiosity than genuine goodwill toward the couple. Harriet, waiting in a side chapel with her father, felt surprisingly calm. Her gown of ivory silk and Flemish lace was the most beautiful garment she had ever worn, designed by the finest modiste in London under the Countess's enthusiastic supervision. Her veil, secured with a diamond tiara that had belonged to Sebastian's mother, framed her face in a cloud of delicate tulle. "You look beautiful, my dear," the Earl said, his voice thick with emotion. "Far lovelier than any of those giggling debutantes who pitied you these past seasons." "Thank you, father," she replied, squeezing his hand, "for everything, for raising me to value my mind, for never forcing me to marry simply for security, for believing I deserved more." "You deserved everything," he said simply, "and remarkably it seems you've found it." The music swelled, signaling the beginning of the ceremony. As Harriet processed down the long aisle on her father's arm, she was aware of the hundreds of eyes upon her, the whispered comments, the speculative glances, but all faded to insignificance as her gaze found Sebastian waiting at the altar. He stood tall and straight, resplendent in formal attire that emphasized his impressive physique. But it was his expression that caught and held her attention, a look of such naked adoration, such undisguised joy, that it transformed his usually severe features into something almost boyish in its openness. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of solemn words, meaningful vows, and the warm pressure of Sebastian's hand holding hers. When the Archbishop pronounced them husband and wife, and Sebastian lifted her veil to claim his first kiss as her husband, Harriet felt a sense of rightness, of homecoming, that transcended the grandeur of their surroundings. The wedding breakfast that followed at Ravenswood House, the family's London residence, was a sumptuous affair attended by the most elite members of society. Harriet, now officially Her Grace the Duchess of Ravenswood, received congratulations with a composure that belied her inner amazement at the transformation of her circumstances. "You're doing splendidly," Sebastian murmured during a brief moment alone. "Every inch the Duchess." "I'm merely following your example," she replied with a small smile, maintaining dignity in the face of society's curiosity. "Not for much longer," he promised, his eyes darkening with an intensity that sent a shiver of anticipation through her. "Once the last guest departs, we'll be free to begin our life together properly." That life began in earnest later that evening, when their carriage crossed the threshold of Ravenswood Hall, after a journey made in companionable conversation, punctuated by increasingly intimate touches and glances. Sebastian had insisted on returning to his ancestral home rather than remaining in London for their wedding night, preferring privacy and personal significance over convention. As the carriage rolled to a stop before the grand entrance, Sebastian turned to Harriet with an expression that mingled tenderness with unmistakable desire. "Welcome home, Duchess," he said softly, raising her hand to his lips. "Thank you, Duke," she replied with a smile that held equal measures of affection and nervous anticipation. The staff had been instructed to remain minimal and discreet. Only the butler greeted them at the door, informing them that a light supper had been laid in the Duchess's chambers and that the house was otherwise secured for the night. Sebastian dismissed him with thanks, then turned to Harriet with a question in his eyes. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward her. Understanding his intent, she nodded, her breath catching as he swept her into his arms with surprising ease. Carrying her across the threshold and up the grand staircase, Sebastian spoke quietly, intimately. "I've imagined this moment more times than I care to admit," he confessed. "Bringing you home as my wife, my Duchess, my heart's companion." "And does the reality match your imagination?" she asked, her arms around his neck, her face close to his. "It exceeds it," he replied simply, "as you always have." The Duchess's chambers, Her chambers now had been transformed with flowers, candles, and subtle touches that spoke of careful planning. A fire burned in the grate despite the summer evening, casting a golden glow over the elegant furnishings. The bed, a magnificent four-poster draped in silk the color of champagne, dominated the room without overwhelming it. Sebastian set her gently on her feet, his hands lingering at her waist. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "The supper can wait if you'd prefer." "It can wait," she agreed softly, summoning courage she wasn't entirely sure she possessed. Though educated in the basic facts of marital relations, Harriet was acutely aware of her inexperience compared to Sebastian's presumed knowledge. As if sensing her thoughts, he took her hands in his. "We have all night," he assured her. "All our lives, in fact. There's no rush, no expectations beyond what feels right to both of us." The tenderness in his voice eased her nerves somewhat. "I want this," she said honestly. I've never—" "I know," he said, raising a hand to cup her cheek, "and I'm honored to be the one to show you. But you must promise to tell me if anything is uncomfortable or unwelcome. Our marriage will be built on honesty in all things, including this." His consideration, his patience, melted the last of Harriet's apprehension. Rising on tiptoe, she initiated a kiss that began gently but quickly deepened, as Sebastian responded with carefully restrained passion. What followed was a slow, sweet discovery of each other. Sebastian helped her out of her traveling dress with reverent hands, his breath catching audibly when she stood before him in only her thin chemise. In turn, she helped remove his coat and waistcoat, her fingers trembling slightly as they encountered the warm solidity of his chest through his shirt. "You're beautiful," he murmured, his grey eyes dark with desire as he drew her toward the bed. "More beautiful than I ever imagined." "As are you," she replied truthfully, amazed by the strength and grace of his form as he shed the last of his clothing. Their first joining was careful, tender, Sebastian mindful of her innocence and determined to ensure her pleasure before his own. He whispered endearments in both English and Portuguese as he guided her through the initial discomfort into a realm of sensation she had never imagined possible. Afterwards, lying in his arms with her head pillowed on his chest, Harriet felt a sense of completeness, of rightness, that transcended the physical act they had shared. "Happy?" Sebastian asked, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Extraordinarily so," she confirmed, tilting her face up for a proper kiss. "Is it always like this?" His laugh was low and warm against her skin. "No," he said honestly. "This is exceptional, but I believe it will only improve as we learn each other more thoroughly." "A scientific approach," she teased. "Observation, experimentation, refinement of technique." "Precisely," he agreed, rolling her beneath him with playful intent. "And I've always been a dedicated scholar." The following weeks were a honeymoon in the truest sense, a time of discovery, of establishing patterns and preferences, of learning to live together as husband and wife. Sebastian introduced Harriet to every aspect of the estate, from the home farm, where he had implemented progressive agricultural methods, to the village school, where he had quietly funded improvements to education for both boys and girls. "I want you to feel this is truly your home," he explained as they rode across the estate one morning. "Not just as my wife, but as the Duchess of Ravenswood in your own right. These people, this land, they're your responsibility now as much as mine." "It's a little overwhelming," she admitted, "the scope of it all." "Which is why we approach it together," he replied. "Your intelligence, your compassion, your fresh perspective, they're exactly what Ravenswood needs, what I need." As summer gave way to autumn, they established a rhythm to their life together. Mornings were spent on estate business, with Harriet gradually assuming responsibilities that suited her skills and interests. She took particular interest in the village school and in establishing a lending library for tenant families, while Sebastian focused on agricultural improvements and broader political matters that occasionally required correspondence with London. Afternoons often found them in the Tower Library, reading or working on separate projects, but sharing the comfortable silence of two people entirely at ease in each other's presence. Sometimes Sebastian would read aloud from Portuguese poetry, his deep voice bringing the words to life in a way that made Harriet fall in love with him all over again. Evenings were for more intimate pleasures, conversations by the fire, music in the drawing room where Harriet played the pianoforte, while Sebastian listened with evident appreciation, and ultimately the increasingly passionate exploration of each other in the privacy of their bedchamber. "I never imagined marriage could be like this," Harriet confessed one night as they lay entwined, the sweat of their lovemaking cooling on their skin. "So equal, so consuming." "Nor did I," Sebastian admitted, trailing his fingers along the curve of her spine. "I expected compatibility, respect, perhaps even affection in time. But this consuming passion, this sense that you're essential to my very being, this exceeds all expectation." As winter approached, they reluctantly prepared to return to London for the opening of Parliament, where Sebastian's position required his attendance. The prospect of facing society as a married couple, of Harriet taking her place as the Duchess of Ravenswood in the very circles that had once dismissed her, brought a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. "They'll be watching for any sign of discord," Sebastian warned as their carriage approached London. "Any hint that our marriage isn't as fulfilling as it appears." "Let them watch," Harriet replied with newfound confidence. "What they see will only confound them further." Their arrival in the capital caused the stir Sebastian had predicted. Invitations flooded Ravenswood House as hostesses vied for the honor of presenting the new Duchess to society. With Sebastian's guidance, Harriet selected those events that would establish her position without overwhelming her with superficial socializing. Her first appearance as Duchess was at a formal dinner hosted by the Prime Minister, a deliberate choice that placed her immediately in the highest echelon of society. Dressed in a gown of deep burgundy velvet that complemented her auburn hair and fair complexion, with the Ravenswood diamonds at her throat and ears, Harriet entered the dining room on Sebastian's arm with a composure that belied her inner nervousness. "Her Grace, the Duchess of Ravenswood," the butler announced, and all conversation ceased as heads turned to observe her entrance. Sebastian's hand tightened reassuringly on hers. "Remember who you are," he murmured. "It's not just my wife, but a woman of substance in your own right." The dinner proceeded with formal correctness, Harriet seated in a position of honor befitting her rank. The conversation around her was primarily political, touching on matters of international diplomacy and domestic policy that would have excluded most society wives. To the evident surprise of several gentlemen present, Harriet contributed thoughtfully to the discussion, her comments informed by both her own reading and conversations with Sebastian. "Your Duchess is remarkably educated, Ravenswood," observed Lord Liverpool, the Prime Minister, with a mixture of surprise and reluctant admiration. "Indeed," Sebastian agreed, his pride evident, "one of her many qualities that made her the only possible choice for my wife." As the weeks passed, Harriet found her footing in her new role. The initial curiosity about her marriage gave way to a grudging acceptance, as society witnessed the obvious devotion between the Duke and his unconventional bride. Those who had predicted a swift end to the match were forced to revise their expectations as the couple presented a united front at every public appearance. Not all reactions were positive, of course. Caroline Berkeley remained vocally skeptical, suggesting to anyone who would listen that the Duke must surely regret his hasty choice. Her comments might have wounded Harriet in her previous life, but now, secure in Sebastian's love and her own position, they seemed merely petty and irrelevant. "Lady Berkeley continues to predict our imminent estrangement," she mentioned to Sebastian one evening as they prepared for a ball at Almack's. "According to her, you're already seeking consolation elsewhere." "Am I indeed?" he replied with amusement, adjusting his cravat. "How enterprising of me, considering I can scarcely bear to leave your side for parliamentary sessions." "She's particularly fixated on Lady Augusta Hamilton," Harriet continued, naming a young beauty recently arrived from the country. "Apparently you were observed speaking to her for a full 5 minutes at Lady Jersey's musicale." Sebastian moved to stand behind her at the dressing table, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "I was explaining to Lady Augusta that while her singing voice is indeed pleasant, my wife's intellectual conversation provides more lasting satisfaction." Harriet laughed, leaning back against him. "You didn't." "I most certainly did," he confirmed, dropping a kiss on her bare shoulder, though perhaps in slightly more diplomatic terms. The ball at Almack's proved to be something of a turning point in society's acceptance of Harriet. As she and Sebastian moved through the elaborate figures of a quadrille, she became aware of a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a transition from curiosity and skepticism to a more genuine acknowledgement of her position. "You've won them over," Sebastian observed as they took a turn about the room during an interval between dances. "Not that their approval matters to me, but I confess it pleases me to see you recognized as you deserve to be." "I think they're simply growing accustomed to the idea," Harriet replied. "The novelty of our match is fading." "Perhaps," he conceded, "but there's more to it than that. You carry yourself differently now, with confidence, with assurance. You've grown into your role as Duchess in a way that commands respect." It was true, Harriet realized. The shy retiring spinster, who had spent 7 seasons fading into the background, had been replaced by a woman who knew her worth, who had been loved and valued for precisely those qualities society had once dismissed as undesirable in a wife. As the London season progressed, Harriet found unexpected fulfillment in aspects of her role as Duchess. While the endless rounds of social engagement still held little appeal, she discovered that her position gave her influence in areas she genuinely cared about. With Sebastian's enthusiastic support, she became a patron of several educational charities, focusing particularly on opportunities for girls from disadvantaged backgrounds. The school Sebastian had established in London expanded under her guidance, adding classes in natural philosophy and mathematics to the existing curriculum. Harriet herself occasionally taught lessons, finding joy in encouraging young minds that reminded her of her own frustrated intellectual curiosity at their age. "You've given this place new life," Sebastian observed during one of their visits to the school. "The girls adore you." "They adore the opportunities," she corrected gently, "as I would have, had such a place existed when I was their age." "Then I'm doubly glad to have created it," he replied, watching with evident pride as she guided a student through a particularly challenging mathematical problem. Their partnership extended beyond philanthropic endeavors. Sebastian increasingly sought Harriet's counsel on political matters, valuing her perspective and analytical mind. When an important diplomatic negotiation required his presence in Vienna, he insisted on Harriet accompanying him, an unusual step for a peer of the realm, but one that reflected his genuine desire for her companionship and input. "My father would have consulted only other men of his rank," Sebastian admitted as they journeyed across Europe, "but I find your insights often perceive nuances that others miss." "Perhaps because I spent so many years observing from the sidelines," Harriet suggested. "When one is invisible, one sees much that others miss." "You'll never be invisible again," he promised, taking her hand. "Not to me, not to society, not to history." The Vienna Congress proved to be a triumph for both Sebastian's diplomacy and Harriet's social grace. The Austrian nobility, less bound by English prejudices, readily accepted the intelligent Duchess of Ravenswood, and several influential diplomatic wives sought her company specifically. "How you charm them without trying," Sebastian observed, after a particularly successful dinner, where Harriet had conversed fluently in German with a Prussian minister whose goodwill was crucial to their negotiations. "Simply by being yourself, thoughtful, well-informed, genuinely interested in their perspectives." "I am interested," she said simply. "These are fascinating times, and we're privileged to witness them from a position of influence." Upon their return to England, life settled into a pleasing rhythm divided between London and Ravenswood Hall. Their first wedding anniversary was celebrated quietly at the estate, with only family and closest friends in attendance, a marked contrast to the public spectacle of their wedding, but far more in keeping with their private preferences. "Happy?" Sebastian asked, as they strolled through the rose garden after their guests had departed. "Immeasurably so," Harriet replied, leaning into his embrace, "though I confess there's one aspect of our life together that I'm eager to expand." "And what might that be, Duchess?" he inquired, his arms tightening around her. "Our family," she said softly. "I find myself increasingly drawn to the idea of children. A son with your grey eyes and commanding presence, perhaps, or a daughter with a mind as keen as yours." Sebastian's face transformed with joy as he understood her meaning. "You're with child?" Harriet nodded, her own happiness reflected in his expression. "The doctor confirmed it yesterday. We should expect an heir to Ravenswood by winter's end." He lifted her in a careful embrace, spinning her gently before setting her back on her feet. "My brilliant, wonderful Harriet," he murmured against her hair. Every day you give me new reasons to thank whatever fate or providence led me to notice you all those years ago. Finalmente eu encontrei, she whispered, reversing his Portuguese phrase from their courtship. Finally, I found you. And I, you, he replied, kissing her with a tenderness that spoke volumes about the depth of his love. Always and forever, my heart's perfect match. The news of the Duchess's condition spread quickly through society, adding final legitimacy to a marriage that had begun with such widespread skepticism. Even Caroline Berkeley was forced to acknowledge that the Duke appeared genuinely delighted by the prospect of fatherhood, his attentiveness to his wife increasing rather than diminishing as her pregnancy progressed. By the time their son was born, a healthy, robust boy with his father's grey eyes and his mother's determined expression, the story of their unconventional courtship had become something of a romantic legend. The spinster who had watched 7 seasons of debutantes marry before capturing the heart of England's most elusive duke was now firmly established as one of the most respected and admired women in society. "He has your chin," Sebastian observed as they sat together by the nursery fire, watching their infant son sleep peacefully in his cradle. "And I suspect your stubborn nature." "Heaven help us if he has yours," Harriet replied with a fond smile. "One utterly determined Goddard in the family is quite enough. Says the woman who refused 3 proposals before accepting mine," he teased, drawing her closer to his side. "I was waiting for the right one," she said simply. "As were you." Sebastian pressed a kiss to her temple, and found her against all odds and expectations, the woman who saw beyond the Duke to the man beneath, the woman who matched me in mind and heart, the woman who watched others marry for 7 long years, Harriet mused, until the most powerful Duke in England whispered, "I found you and changed everything." "Not everything," he corrected gently. "You were always extraordinary, Harriet. I merely had the good fortune to recognize it when others failed to see past convention." As their son stirred and began to fuss, Sebastian lifted him carefully from the cradle, cradling him with a tenderness that melted Harriet's heart anew. Watching them together, the powerful Duke and the tiny heir already forming a bond that would shape the future of Ravenswood, she reflected on the strange, wonderful journey that had brought her here, from wallflower to duchess, from resigned spinster to beloved wife, from observer of others' happiness to creator of her own. "What are you thinking?" Sebastian asked, noting her contemplative expression. "That some things are worth waiting 7 seasons for," she replied with a smile that conveyed all the love and contentment in her heart. "That sometimes the most powerful love stories begin with a whisper rather than a shout." "Finalmente eu a encontrei," he murmured, echoing the words that had begun their journey together. "And I found you," she replied, joining him to complete their family circle, "for always and forever." The end. Dear listener, in the quiet moment after our story ends, I invite you to close your eyes and picture Sebastian's library, that magnificent circular room filled with generations of wisdom, hidden away in a tower where few ever ventured. Like that special sanctuary, you too hold within you a lifetime of extraordinary stories that many never see. Your hands have held babies who are now parents themselves. Your eyes have witnessed technological marvels transform from impossible dreams to everyday conveniences. Your heart has expanded, broken, healed, and grown stronger through loves found and lost. What a magnificent journey you've traveled. Society often speaks as if life's greatest adventures belong to the young, but they miss the profound truth. It is you who now possesses the freedom that youth can only imagine. You've earned the liberty to speak your mind without apology, to wear what brings you comfort, to befriend whom you choose, and to spend your precious time exactly as you wish. When Harriet heard those Portuguese words, she discovered someone had been seeing her all along. But you don't need a duke to recognize your worth. The wisdom in your soul and the stories in your heart are treasures beyond measure, waiting for you to acknowledge them yourself. Tonight, as you settle into rest, remember this: the most beautiful quality you possess is not one that diminishes with time but grows more luminous, your authenticity. You have earned the right to be unapologetically yourself. What freedom, what power. Sleep will come easier when you recognize that tomorrow isn't a burden to carry, but a gift to unwrap at your own pace. The dawn brings not obligations, but opportunities to share your unique light with a world that needs exactly what only you can give. your perspective, your kindness, your particular way of seeing beauty where others might miss it. You're not just surviving each day. You are a living library of experience, a testament to resilience, a masterpiece still being painted with each sunrise. Rest peacefully in that knowledge tonight. With all our gratitude, Legends of the Fall team. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end. We hope this story warmed your heart, stirred your soul, and reminded you that love, true, deep, soul-seeing love, can arrive when you least expect it. If you felt moved, please like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone you care about. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel to stay with us on this beautiful journey. Your support means everything to us. It helps us stay inspired to bring you more stories filled with love, redemption, and soul-stirring twists. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another one of our original tales. Click it and be surprised by another emotional and unforgettable story. Thank you for being here, the Legends of the Fall team.